Let's take our knowledge of random numbers and use them to draw flower gardens. I stepped out of my door the other day and I saw this really nice arrangement of purple flowers right near the stairs, and I thought, hey, I'll use that as my inspiration. You may remember that there was a company called De Pade Freyling who did some really wonderful animation for television, primarily in the 60s and 70s. They had a really offbeat, kind of hand-drawn style. And I thought, let's use that for this flower garden. So let me show you the result, and then I'll show you how we use random numbers to create it. Here are my flower gardens. They're random. Now, the computer could be drawing these at 30 frames per second, but I'm leaving each one up for 2 seconds so we can enjoy it before it goes on to the next one. And you can see that these gardens have a lot of randomness in them. Each flower has a different number of petals. The petals are not perfectly symmetrical, and they're not arranged in exactly the same way. The stalks are not all vertically straight. Things are just mixed up a little bit. And I think that that gives these gardens a little bit of interest. The trick to drawing this garden is figuring out how to draw one flower. And then I just draw a bunch of flowers. In fact, on every frame, there's anywhere from 20 to 40 flowers. So let's see how we use random numbers to generate just one flower, and then we'll just look at the loop that does 20 of them. Of course, it always begins with some sort of a design or some sort of a sketch. And I drew something by hand that is sort of like this, but here's a cleaned up version that gives me the schematic that I needed to draw a flower. And this tells me everything I need to know. There's a circular bud in the middle. There's a stalk, which starts from the middle of the bud and goes down, but it might drift to the left or the right. And around the bud are multiple petals. Each petal is a little piece of a circle. It has a starting and an ending angle and a radius, but the radius of each petal and the width of the angle that it includes varies from one petal to the next using random numbers. I can draw these petals using arc. So really, to draw this whole flower, it takes only 6 lines, 4 calls to arc to make the petals, 1 call to ellipse to make the center, and 1 call to line to make the stalk. So with this as my guide, I thought, okay, let's see how to make this flower. I'll begin by picking a radius for the flower. This tells me generally the average radius of the petals, and I'll figure out a size for the bud. And that'll be a random number, but it'll be about in this range. And now I decide how many petals I want, and I pick a random number. From my sketch, I had 4, so let's assume we have 4 petals. So all right, we break up the circle into 4 pieces, and now concentrate on the upper right piece, because we're going to draw 1 petal in the upper right quadrant, 1 petal in the upper left, 1 petal in the lower right, 1 petal in the lower left. If we had 5 segments, we would draw 1 petal in each of the 5 segments. But here we just have the 4. So I'm going to break the upper right region into 2 pieces. The ending point of the petal will be somewhere in this triangle, and the starting point will be somewhere in this triangle. Well, but if I put them really anywhere randomly in those triangles, they could just about touch, and then my petal would be super, super thin. So I decided, okay, I'll pick random numbers that don't go the full width of these triangles. So the ending point will be somewhere in that triangle, and the starting point will be somewhere in this triangle. Now, what should the radius of this petal be? Well, it might be a little bit smaller than my starting radius for the overall flower, or a little bit bigger, somewhere in that range. All right, there's a lot of stuff going on, so let's simplify it now. What we know is the starting and ending points of my petal will be somewhere in those 2 purple triangles. So let's identify those. We'll just sort of highlight them. So now I know that my petal will start and end somewhere in these pink areas. Now, what should the radius of the petal be? Well, it'll be a random radius between the small value and the big value. So we'll pick one. There, that's the radius of my petal. Now I'll pick a random angle from the uppermost pink range. There we are. And at that angle, at that radius, there's the ending point of my petal. How about the other one? Well, we just pick a random angle somewhere in there, and that's the point of that petal. And if I draw that petal and get rid of the construction lines, there we are. There's the first petal of my flower. Now, how about the other petals? We just go through the very same process. We pick a starting and ending angle, we pick a radius, and we draw that arc. For the next one, we do the same thing. For the next one, we do the same thing. Bam! we've drawn 4 petals. Well, if we draw the petals first and then we draw the yellow bud will appear to be on top of the petals. Now we still haven't drawn the stalk, so let's think about how that will go. The stalk will start in the middle of the yellow circle and go straight down, but I want it to wiggle a little bit. And I'll say the bottom point of the stalk can move horizontally. It's going to be at the bottom of the screen, but somewhere in that gray triangle. And I'll pick that randomly. So here we get that diagonal line. And if I draw the stalk before I draw the yellow bud, then the bud will end up on top of the stalk and I have my flower. If I draw it in front of a blue background and I put a little green ground on the bottom, bam, I have created one flower. If I have more petals, it's exactly the same process. Let's look at the code. Here's the code. There's not that much to it, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. It really does nothing more than what we just talked about. Up top is setup. It does the usual things, calls size and smooth. And then frame rate 0.5 tells processing, call draw once every other second. So that leaves each frame up for 2 seconds so we can enjoy the picture. Draw draws the background, and then it picks a number of flowers. And the numbers are a random number between 20 and 40, and then I take its integer value. So I know in the back of my head I'm going to get back a number between 20 and 39. But there's nothing magical about these numbers, and that's a fine range for me. Then I run through a little loop, and I say for every flower, I call draw one daisy. And that's it. That's all draw does. So let's look at draw one daisy. Well, it's the very next thing. We'll scroll down a little bit. First thing I do is I pick a center for the daisy. Width times random 0, 1 is the same as random 0, comma width. By doing it this way, I'm able to think about the random number being a number between 0 and 1, and then I'm scaling it up by width. Why do it that way? Well, that's so that I could do this. I wanted to pick a vertical position for the flower that's somewhere in the middle 60% of the screen vertically. I want it to be at least 20% of the way down from the top and 20% of the way up from the bottom. So I can pick a random number between 0.2 and 0.8 and multiply that by height. Now, I could have said, just as well, a random number between height times 0.2 and height times 0.8, and that would work perfectly well, but it's just more typing. I thought that this was a cleaner way to write it. In the same way, I'm going to create my variable r for the radius of the flower to be the same sort of thing. I'm going to pick a random number between 0.1 and 0.2, and then I'm going to multiply that by half the width. And really, these numbers I found just by playing with them. I said, how big should the flowers be? And I just picked a couple of numbers and I just went up and down until those looked good. Now I pick a value for inner r. That's the radius of the little bud in the middle of the flower. And I just use the overall radius that I just created. That already has randomness built into it, so I make the inner radius, the radius of the bud, just 20% of the overall radius. Now, how many petals? That's a random number between 4 and 20. And then I take its integer value. So I'm going to get a random number between 4 and 19. Okay? Now I need to pick a color. So I go to color mode HSB because I want to pick my colors in hue, saturation, and brightness because I just thought that would be a more interesting way to pick flower colors. Absolutely, I could have done this in RGB. To pick a color, first I choose a random hue from 0 to 255. So that spans all the possible hues. For saturation, I pick a value between 100 and 255. Remember that a saturation of 0 will give you a gray color, and I wanted all my colors to have some saturation, so I picked 100. In fact, I probably started out with some other number instead of 100, and then I monkeyed with it until the pictures looked good, and 100 is where I landed. Finally, for brightness, I did the same thing. A brightness of 0 would give me a black color, and I didn't want anything that dark, so I started the brightness at some large number, and after playing with the results, I ended up with 100. So this really lets me control the types of colors I get. And then I create petals color using the same random ranges. So now I have my 2 colors, and I always go back to RGB color mode right away so I don't forget. Now it's time to draw the flower. So I call no fill, and I make sure I draw my black strokes. And first I'm going to draw the stalk. So I draw a line from the center of the bud to a horizontal position that is the center of the bud in X plus or minus 50. And that gives me an horizontal offset that moves the bottom of the line left or right, and its vertical location is height. So now I have my line from the center of the flower to the bottom. I call no stroke to turn off my strokes. I fill with the petal color, and now it's time to draw my petals. The remaining lines do encode exactly what we saw earlier in slides. So I'm not going to talk my way through each one because it'll sound just like the description we heard before when I talked my way through the design process. It's probably unlikely that just by looking at these lines of processing code, you will see how they do the geometry we looked at before. Because these lines are such a close match to what we just saw, I'm going to leave it to you to work your way through them and see how they build the flower. The value of this exercise is that it will give you the confidence you need to figure out other code that you find. You might get code from the web. A friend might give you code. You might find code in a book. And you'll need to work out for yourself what that program is doing and how. Of course, there usually will be at least some comments. I've left the comments out here because I'm trying to pack so much on the screen. But whether there are comments or not, you still need to kind of work your way through the lines. And there's no shortcut. Everyone does it that way. So I encourage you to sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil and work your way through these lines. Take a look at the earlier part of the video again if you want to refresh your memory, and you'll see how these lines of code create the flower in just the way we described before. So let's look again at the results of this program. Each of these gardens is completely unique and unpredictable. We now have a whole family of gardens that will go on forever, and if there were some we really liked, we could just do a screen grab and keep them forever, or we can just enjoy now sitting here and looking at essentially an infinite number of variations on the theme. And I love being surprised by all these wonderful variations on a theme.